Our next reading this morning comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verses 8 through chapter 2, verse 10. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." So they sent taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made their lives bitter for them with harsh labor and mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, saying, "When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live." The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they've already given birth." And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, He established households for them. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but every girl you let live." A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw it was a child, a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I'll pay you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water." The grass withers, the flower fades. The word of the Lord lives forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Water. The stuff that makes for life. Where is life without water? Even in the desert, those living things need water. Even camels and cactuses, they're good at retaining water. That's why they don't seem to need water very often. They do well without much water around, but they still need it. Today we have a very scientific understanding of how water functions in creating and supporting life. We can see that water provides and allows life. Water is the marker when searching for life elsewhere in the universe, on other planets and on other moons. It all begins with the question, is there water? Now, of course, there's other elements that play in, like heat and so forth. But even on a moon of Jupiter, one that has very little heat from the sun to accompany the water there, scientists believe that under a very, very thick layer of ice on that moon, there could be liquid water and a chance for life. They think that that moon is heating itself internally and that there may be liquid water in there. And if there's liquid water, it's worth searching for life. In many ways, for many reasons, we understand that where there is water, there is life. And the most ancient of times, they also understood this completely about water. Now, they didn't know so much all the science that we know, but they knew that you needed a water source to survive. Water was seen clearly as something to drink and also something that provides food. It's life all around. They knew how to fish like the best of the pros we might think of today, perhaps even better. They didn't even need sonar or other high-tech equipment to catch fish. They did it on their own. In the story of Jesus, we see that he had disciples who were fishermen. And we see, even in the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, along with the bread given to the people, it was fish, something that came from the water. Water played a very large role in their lives, very large. And they knew that where there was water, there was life. Go back even further, they understood this just as well. In the story of Joseph, crisis came when the water ran dry. That's what caused the famine. Without water, the entire region ran into desperate times. Times that were critical. Times they had to find some way to survive with that lack of water. Joseph helped Egypt be ready for it. And a few generations later, Joseph's descendants in Egypt were still there. And they had grown numerous and strong. And this is where we enter into the story today. Finding a strained relationship between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Because the Hebrews had grown so numerous and strong. The Egyptians were starting to worry about those growing numbers. So the Egyptians turned the Hebrews into slaves, setting taskmasters over them, sticking them with the harsh labor of working with brick and mortar and field jobs also, really making life miserable for them. Now, this picture right here is something that is actually found in the tomb in Egypt. And it's like a physical record of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. And I just thought that was really interesting. I wanted to show you that. So with them working and even in slavery, Egypt was still concerned about how many Hebrews there were. Even having this taskmasters over them, they were getting a little nervous. Thinking that if the Hebrews were to decide to rise up against Egypt, they would actually be capable of doing some serious damage, if not contributing with other enemies to toppling Egypt completely. Pharaoh was especially concerned about the men and the boys. Why? Because that's who were able or would grow up to be able to be soldiers and warriors. So Pharaoh decided to take action against them. Now, Egypt was and still is a nation that depends heavily on the Nile River. The theme of drawing life up out of the water was very familiar to them in Egypt, as it was to the ancient Israelites before they got there. The Nile is the main source for life in that area, and they even have a system to store the water, and they've had this for thousands of years, to store the water of the Nile when it rises every year, so that they can store that water and then use it for a longer period of time after the Nile has gone back down. They've become masters at using the water to provide for the life and the vegetation and everything they needed in Egypt. But Pharaoh, he came up with a new idea of how the Nile could be used. This time, not for everyone to receive life, This plan was about preserving Egyptian life at the expense of Hebrew life. Well, actually, at first, his plan was to have the Hebrew midwives kill the boys that the women gave birth to. But as the Hebrew midwives refused to do so, Pharaoh came up with his Nile River idea. And I'll pause for a minute to draw your attention to Puah and Shiphrah, the Hebrew midwives that were ordered to kill the boys. Now, they acted like they were going to play along with Pharaoh's plan, but really they just refused to do what he wanted. They told him that the Hebrew women were just too vigorous and they gave birth too fast. If you look at the Hebrew there, that word that they use for vigorous, it has a connection to the word used for life. So basically, kind of what they were saying is that the Hebrew women were too full of life. They couldn't be stopped from giving birth. And to think a little bit more about the play on words that's going on here in the Hebrew text, Puah and Shiphrah, their names actually mean beautiful and splendid. So whether or not they're the real names of these women in the story, we're not so sure, because it may be something that is just representative here of this important action. But what they did and who they were was absolutely beautiful and splendid, because despite the death that Pharaoh was trying to bring, they sought out to save life. Not often are women mentioned by name in the Bible. So these two stand out as very, very, very important into the story. God took note of their actions and of their faith and dealt well with them from then on, taking care of them from then on. But even though God was happy with them saving the Hebrew boys, Pharaoh was not so happy about it. Pharaoh turned to all of the Egyptian people after that and ordered them to throw into the Nile every Hebrew boy that was born. Therefore, getting back to his plan about the Nile, using the Nile to kill the Hebrew boys so that he could save Egyptian life. Well, that was his Nile River plan. That's what he set out to do, and many children were killed. Now, as Christians, we also remember how this story was relived later on by King Herod looking for Jesus. It was a terrible sight. You can just imagine the grief, the weeping, and the wailing of the Hebrews. God took notice of the Hebrews' suffering. God stepped in to go against Pharaoh's plan. So then we get to this Levite couple. Now remember, the Levites are the group of the ancient Israelites who were the priestly tribe. So we've already got an idea something's coming when we see that they were Levites. A Levite couple gave birth to a beautiful boy and were motivated to do something, to do anything to save his life. So his mother hid him for 3 months. He got too big to hide anymore, so his mom made a basket for him to send him to safety. She floated the basket with that boy in it on the waters of the Nile River, that very river where so many children were being killed. Sent him down the stream. Worried about him, his sister followed him as he floated along the waters. Upon which he floated right down to Pharaoh's household, where Pharaoh's daughter was bathing, and she found him. She was struck by his beauty. She took pity on it. She had her servants draw him up out of the water. She decided to keep him and raise him. But she needed somebody to care for him in his young age. After all, she was Pharaoh's daughter. So, coincidentally, his sister was there, offered to help. And Pharaoh's daughter sent Moses' sister to go and find a caretaker, who coincidentally again was his mom. Their mom got him back and got paid for nursing and raising her own son. That's pretty cool. Until it was time to give him back to Pharaoh's household. There he became the son of Pharaoh's daughter, making him Pharaoh's grandson, putting him in the royal house in Egypt, setting him up for an opportunity to yield great power and be able to have an impact on what was going on there. That's when he got his name, when Pharaoh's daughter brought him up out of the water. Fittingly, he was named Moshe. Moses, as we say it, which means drawn from the water. These names are very important, have a lot of rich meaning. Drawn from the water. That's why she explained that she gave him that name, because she literally picked him up out of the water. The rivers of this, the water of this river, the Nile, were being used for death by Pharaoh. But God stepped in and reversed that, making those waters what they were meant to provide in the first place, life. Life was drawn out of the water that day, literally by Moses' young life being drawn out of the water and saved. But in the bigger picture, so Moses would grow up and lead an entire people out of suffering and into new life. From the water comes life. We are reminded of this from the stories of early Israel to the stories of Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is asking who his disciples say he is. Simon Peter says the million-dollar answer and says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." To which Jesus responds with blessings of life and promises to him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This is a familiar statement for us because this is what we say before we get baptized and before we join the church. I believe that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of the living God. We begin our Christian lives with that statement and with the waters of baptism. We begin a journey of receiving life from God and giving life to others. Baptism uses water to help us understand how living in Christ is all about giving life. God giving life to the world through Jesus, much like God giving life to the world through water. Now, we are not people of Pharaoh. We are not people of death and destruction. We are people of God. And as people of God in Jesus Christ, as people of Moses, as people of the water, we are people of life. That's who we are. That's our identity. And every step we take during the day should be focused around giving life. Offering life unto this world. Sharing God's life with this world. Helping others and ourselves to thrive. All of us together. Not selectively like Pharaoh did, but all-encompassing like God does. May we live into our identity, and may God give life to the world through us. Amen.